Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm your host, AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Laura Saetveit Miles. She is Associate Professor of British Literature in the Department of Foreign Languages at the University of Bergen in Norway. She works on medieval religious culture in England, especially devotional, visionary, mystical, and monastic literatures. Laura, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So you've joined us today to tell us all about Richard Methley, but before we get too in-depth into his work, I'd like to hear a little bit more about yours. So how did you first become interested in mystical texts and literature?
Well, I read some Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp and the Pearl Poet in college when I was doing medieval literature. And so ever since then, I've just been totally hooked. And I think that it's some of the most interesting literature out there.
Is there something in particular about it that you find so fascinating?
Well, I guess I really appreciate how these texts try to capture an experience that the person really took seriously, and that especially the readers, their contemporary readers, medieval readers, took these accounts seriously and took the experiences seriously. So I appreciate that there's this desire to capture something that they really believe happened. And so I think it's kind of our duty to take that seriously. Whether or not we believe that it happened or not, we take the text seriously and we look at it as this view into someone's personal experience.
So let's get into these experiences then by talking about Richard Methley. So what do we know about him?
So Richard Methley was a Carthusian monk of Mount Grace Charterhouse, which was up in the north of England. And the Carthusians were a contemplative order, so they didn't really leave their cells, which were rather spacious, and they were even much more hermit-like within their cloister than other monks. So his works didn't travel much outside of his own monastery that we know of. And after the Reformation, those works don't seem to have been read at all. There's only actually one surviving manuscript with his three main mystical works. So nobody really read, that we know of, Richard Methley from the Reformation, 1538, 39, until the 70s, 80s.
That's a long time.
Yeah, it's a really long time. And we have James Hogg to thank. He really has been the foremost scholar on Carthusian spirituality and the history of the Carthusian order. And he published the edition of Methley's Latin works with John P.H. Clarke. So he published them some years ago and then came out with a new updated edition in 2016 in the Analecta Carthusiana series. So what I'm hoping is that there's renewed interest in Methley, or new interest in Methley, because of this new translation that has just been published.
So do we have much in the way of biographical information about Methley?
No, we don't know a lot at all. What we do know is from what he actually mentions in these mystical treatises, which are somewhat autobiographical. We know that he became a member of the order in 1476 when he was 25, and that he died in 1528. And we know quite a lot about his kind of spiritual progression, his experiences during those decades that he was a Carthusian monk, because his texts are very carefully dated, which I think is one of the most interesting parts about them. Especially, for instance, the Refectory of Salvation is kind of a mystical diary, in essence, where he says, this is the year 1487, and here are all these experiences that I went through on this day and this day and this day. And he dates them very precisely. So although we don't know much about his life before profession, we know quite a lot about his inner spiritual life during his time as a monk.
I think when most people think of monastic communities during this period, they think of Cistercians or Benedictines. Can you speak a little bit about what it was like in a Carthusian monastery?
Yeah, the Carthusians are very interesting because they prided themselves on being the most ascetic, contemplative order possible. So the monks did not gather for every part of the divine office. They only came out of their cells for matins and vespers and on Sundays. Otherwise, they celebrated the entire divine office by themselves in their cells. So this is a huge difference from pretty much all other orders. They called themselves hermits in this way. So Methley calls himself a kind of hermit. So they saw themselves as very solitary in contrast to other monastic orders. And what that meant was that they had a lot of time to be in their cells and write books. So they didn't go out and preach to people. They didn't serve the public. They served the word. And they copied books in their cells individually. They didn't have a main scriptorium. They had a writing desk in each of their cells where they copied books and wrote books. And there are many great Carthusian authors and translators and commentators. So Methley describes sitting at his desk in his cell and writing, which is quite interesting. And his cell was not like those of the Benedictines or Cistercians. It was an apartment, and it had different rooms, and it had an enclosed garden. It was essentially a self-sustaining little mini monastery, still on a cloister, but a very different, much more solitary, contemplative model of monasticism with the Carthusians.
With that amount of solitude inherent in the order, is there any sort of sense of community in his text?
Well, he doesn't really talk about his fellow monks, but he does talk about being in the communal services that they had. So then there's a kind of implied audience to his experiences, but these are really balanced out by a very clear importance of his solitary cell, where he's obviously in his cell most of the time, and that is where a lot of experiences happen. But there is a clear importance for him on the gathering together to have matins and vespers, these night offices, because that is when he experiences many of his ravishings and his kind of trances in essentially public amongst his other monks.
As public as it gets for a monk.
Yeah, but he doesn't talk about that. It's really about him and his experience. He is not discussing gossip or what's happening with his fellow monks, but he does address them. So his works are often addressed, my dear brothers, my fellow hermits. So he is thinking of himself in this community. So he sees his voice as reaching out to his community of monks from his solitary cell, which is quite powerful, but it's a positive relationship. He's not chastising them. He is encouraging them, and he is trying to inspire them with his own experiences.
His mystical experiences and practices, what do they look like?
I would say it's kind of a blend of very affective, emotional, effusive, one might say cataphatic or Rallian, so much like Richard Ralla and his style. Very ecstatic experiences, balanced out by a much more kind of apophatic experience where there is a real absence of any kind of feeling or sensation. And it is really about a knotting of the soul. So that's much closer to the kind of cloud of unknowing. So Methley knew both Richard Ralla's mystical texts as well as the cloud of unknowing, which was quite the opposite. And Methley shows a combination of these two types of mystical experiences. So Methley talks a lot about his body and his body burning with love and experiencing all kinds of physical manifestations of these mystical experiences. And he really talks about his body as a channel for joy and as a channel for feeling wondrous things. So it's very positive in that way. And he doesn't have any problem with how his body reacts and how he sees the divine, really kind of expressing its proximity through how his body feels things and expresses things, and indeed how he loses control over his body because God is kind of in charge, and at the same time being taken out of his body and having an experience that is, one could say, completely intellectual and not very corporal. So it's really a fairly wide range of kinds of experiences that he has. And he has a few visions, but not very many visions. So his dominant kind of mode of mystical experience is one of what he would say is ravishment of varying degrees. And he uses that word in Latin.
So what does a ravishment look like? Because obviously there's a lot of other ways of interpreting that word.
Yeah, that's a bit vague. I mean, I'm not sure that he necessarily explains it so precisely that we can know exactly. But for instance, you know what? Maybe I can just read you a little passage. So this is one of my favorite passages, and I really think it captures a lot about how Methley describes what he goes through. And it's from the Refectory of Salvation. And the Refectory of Salvation records his mystical encounters between October 6th and December 13th of 1487. So it's really most diary-like.
And a very short time period.
Very short time period. Mystical encounters or, ravishings or this whole range of experiences happening every few days. And so he documents them. So this is chapter 6. Today, that is the day after the feast of Saint Dionysius, the great contemplative, just after the 8th hour, according to the English way of reckoning the hours, I began to say terce alone in choir, with my bodily eyes closed and my spiritual eyes open. Then jubilant melody descended upon me with melodious jubilation, together with the amorous languor that can heal all things. And they have not yet departed from me. Rather, my heart is perceptibly dancing in my chest, even as I write. And it is now after 10 in the morning on the same day.
So, like, feelings and music and heart palpitations.
Exactly. So, a lot of Richard Rolla can be heard in this passage with his canor and languor and dulcor. So there's some of that, but then there's also something quite different where he is describing this feeling continuously and immediately. It's happening as he's writing, which I think is quite rare. I mean, have you come across that?
No, I haven't, but I mean, that could be because the majority of the people that I have studied are women who did not write for themselves, but instead had scribes. So there is an assumption of time passing between their experience of the vision and their relaying of that information to their scribe for recording.
That's much more typical. And I think that contrast is totally fascinating because it's a gender contrast. It's an accessibility to writing implements contrast. But it's also this sense that Methley knows immediately that this is something that needs to be communicated to others and that it needs to be documented immediately. And so that kind of immediacy, I think, is very unusual and I think is really quite rare. And he is doing his own discernment, one might say. There's no discretio spiritum from some other external authority here. And he comments on that elsewhere. So I think that Methley provides a really interesting juxtaposition to other female mystics and other mystics such as Suso and others, who have very different ways of documenting their mystical encounters, and that really Methley's quite an anomaly.
And it sounds like in this case, he's recording his own experiences almost for his own record keeping, rather than as part of a guide for achieving mystical experience or connection with God directed at other people. At least, I mean, in the case of this text.
that's a really good point, because some of his earlier treatises, just from a few years earlier, are much more about educating his readers. So he might describe his own vision or mystical feelings or trances or ravishments, but then he uses them in order to teach the reader about how to deal with these and how to process them and how to identify them. So the School of Languishing Love is much more like a schooling text. And the same with the Bedroom of the Beloved Beloved. Not as much. It's more based in transmitting his experiences, but you can kind of see his progression and also his expected progression of his readers, that now they are ready to read these kind of pure documentary witness accounts, and they can understand them properly because they have read his previous texts.
So what are the differences between these three texts as far as genre and the things they cover and the expectations of their use?
They're pretty similar. In general, he always expects their use to be among his fellow brothers, his fellow Carthusian monks. So there's one little hint that he might expect women to be reading some of his texts, but that might be Carthusian nuns who are on the continent, might be other nuns, but it's definitely contemplatives, enclosed solitaries that he's aiming for, not lay readers. And what he does is, for each of the texts, he kind of latches onto a phrase that he ruminates around and spins his words around and uses as a kind of bouncing off point for describing what he is going through and what those mystical encounters mean. For instance, the School of Languishing Love, the refrain for that is from Song of Songs, Amore langueo, I languish for love. So he kind of extrapolates all the possible meanings of this and how he experiences this feeling of languishing. And then in his second treatise, The Bedroom of the Beloved Beloved, the beloved being Jesus, and he is beloved. So it's kind of evoking his circular style here. Also the Song of Songs, Ego dormio, et cor meum vigilat. I sleep and my heart is awake. In order to capture and explain how he can be in this world, but also experiencing the divine, having this kind of direct union with the divine. That is his heart being awake. His life in the world is sleep, is being asleep. The refectory of salvation also takes on a refrain from the Song of Songs. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. So it's all about excess in this one. And it's all about this effusive love and effusive exclamations of his experiences.
Is there one of these texts that you particularly like?
So I really like the Refectory of Salvation because I think the diary format is fascinating. I think it's very unusual how close to a kind of modern diary it is. He actually describes being in the midst of writing, which is really rare in medieval texts because they're always mediated by a kind of time of some kind of a draft copy and then being recopied and being composed somehow in advance, and these processes being very shadowy. But for him, they're right there. Immediate, unmediated writing experience. You know, there's a great passage from the Refectory right after the passage that I just read. And maybe I'll read a little bit of that because it captures both his effusion and his interest in the name of Jesus, and also this weird way that he talks about writing as he's writing or not writing, as the case may be. So let me just read this bit out from chapter 6. Perhaps you would like to hear about the state I was in during the celebration of Mass. So you can hear that he's a little bit informal addressing his reader like this. It's very intimate in a way. Perhaps you would like to hear about the state I was in during the celebration of Mass, but allow me first to cry out to him a little with surpassing exultation. I can die because love is strong as death, and surely, surely I languish for love. So my heart is still dancing in my chest, which is a great sign of the presence of the beloved. O heart, crushed and humbled at first because of sin, deign now to be crushed by excessive love and break into 1,000 fragments. I'll skip a little bit. O Jesu, 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 how long will you delay, and when will you cry, come, 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 and be crowned? This is the way my heart melted. In fact, I almost faint and lose command of my body, for I am forced to stop writing, suspend my pen, and cry out, oh, Jesu, 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 how long will you delay, and when will you cry, come, 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 and be crowned? So this passage to me is remarkable. He says he's about to do something. He's interrupted by his continuing ravishment. And then he says, my ravishment is so overwhelming, I have to stop writing, which obviously he is writing about, not writing. It's just so unusual, this kind of authenticity, but it's a bit artificial, but at the same time, it's so raw. There's these occasional moments that capture the immediate experience and are not a reflection on something that happened either recently in the past or longer ago in the past. And very rarely, occasionally, later on in the text, he will reflect back on what he said earlier and what it means. But he does not provide a kind of extensive apparatus of interpretation. And in that way, totally different from somebody like Julian of Norwich, whose entire body of work is extensive reflection back on events that happened in the past, sometimes decades in the past.
It is really interesting to see these revelations and experiences separated from all of the reflection and be able to access the immediacy of the mystic's reaction to them. And the physicality and emotion and crying and screaming God's name, he has a little bit of Marjorie Kemp about him.
Well, you're totally right. And it's interesting you should say that because one of the readers of the Marjorie Kemp manuscript saw the similarity between Methley and Marjorie. So there's some very famous annotations in the Marjorie Kemp manuscript by a medieval reader who could have been a Carthusian. The Marjorie Kemp manuscript was held by Mountgrace, and some medieval reader, probably a Carthusian monk, wrote in the margins several places comparing Marjorie's ecstatic, effusive ravishings, especially with tears, comparing them to Methley, saying, as our Methley was wont to do. So this is really exciting because we get a contemporary view on how Marjorie fit into other mystics and visionaries in that period. And we also see that Methley, a male contemplative monk, no problem with being compared to this female visionary. Not a problem at all. They are equally valid, authentic mystics. The real question is, did Methley know about Marjorie Kemp? Because she died long before him, and the book of Marjorie Kemp, the manuscript, was written before him. But the comments in the margins refer to Methley in the past tense, like he has died. So sometime between 1528 and 1538, presumably, these comments came into the margins. And I think there's a lot more to say about those marginal annotations, especially now that we have these new translations of Methley's text. So it's easier for other people to go back and think about a comparison between Marjorie Kemp and Richard Methley. And what do these two mystics at either end of the century show us about late medieval spirituality?
So, Laura, can you tell us about these new translations and how did they come about?
So Barbara Newman, the scholar of medieval religion, has translated Richard Methley's works his 3 main Latin works: The School of Languishing Love, The Bedroom of the Beloved Beloved, and The Refectory of Salvation. And I've written the introduction to the translation, and it's just come out with Cistercian Studies Liturgical Press imprint. So published in January, available via Liturgical Press or some other non-evil Amazon book supplier near you.
There will be a link in the show notes for anyone out there who wants to get their hands on a copy.
Yeah, and the reason why this translation is so exciting is because Methley writes really hard Latin. His Latin is very difficult. It's very convoluted. There are definitely actual errors in the manuscript copy that we have. Early medieval readers tried to fix those errors. They couldn't figure out what on earth was going on in some of the Latin. Barbara Newman is such a brilliant Latinist. She really did her best, but there are still some passages which are kind of indecipherable. So that is a victim of the transmission process of being copied from manuscript to manuscript, but also because Methley's Latin was idiosyncratic, to say the least. So that's why very few scholars have attempted to read and study and deal with Methley, just a handful. And otherwise, we've kind of left him alone because his Latin editions were hard to find and his Latin itself was hard to read. So in fact, this new translation came about because in 2018, the British Zen master Julian Daizan Skinner somehow heard about these texts and read about them and wanted somebody to translate them. He wanted to hire somebody to translate these texts. And he found a Latinist to translate them for his own purposes, for his own use, because he wanted to learn about the mystical practice, about these techniques of contemplating that Methley describes. Because there are moments when Methley is quite concrete about this is how you sit, and this is how you think, and this is how you put your body and mind into a contemplative trance and pull yourself or invite the divine down towards you, however you want to express it. So Barbara Newman kind of took up this need to have a translation of Methley's works. And she did her own translation, so this work is really her own, but it was in response to this person who is not a medieval religious studies scholar, who does not work on medieval England, but who wants to access this tradition of contemplation and mysticism that has been lost and to learn from it. So I think this idea of taking Zen disciples who want to learn from medieval texts. I mean, the cloud has always been of interest for Zen Buddhists, but I think there are other works like Methley's that could also be of interest. So both Barbara and I really tried to aim this translation with my introduction for a wide audience, to both be very helpful for scholars, for specialists, but also accessible for other readers who are not specialists in medieval English culture and who really want to get an idea of what's the cultural context, what's the literary context, what's the linguistic context, and importantly for some, what is the spiritual basis for Methley's practice.
Laura, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing Richard Methley with us and for letting everybody know about these new translations.
I'm very happy to be a part, and I hope that everyone enjoys meeting the wondrous Richard Methley.
And thank you all for listening. Please join me next time when I speak to Lika Smits about Bernard of Clairvaux.